Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're coming from. This is Angela from Women's Personal Finance, and today we have Brynne Conroy, the author of the Feminist Financial Handbook and the blog Fem Frugality, here to talk about personal finance, really more for folks that have more moderate incomes. A lot of the money stuff that gets talked about online is really for folks who can max out all their retirement accounts and have a lot more money and wiggle room to make big moves happen more quickly. And Brynne has really focused more on the folks that are dealing with tighter budgets, which I think is a really important conversation and one that does not get talked about enough. So, Brynne, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit and we can get started. And I'm really glad to have you here. And for everybody who is listening, we are going to give away a copy of her book at the end of this Zoom. So if you are still here watching live, you get a special opportunity to get a copy of her book. So welcome, Brynne.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here, and I'm so grateful to all of you for being here too, whether you're watching now live or in the future. I am really excited to talk to you guys today. I wanted to focus this presentation a little bit more on the topics that I did write about in the Feminist Financial Handbook. And in the book, we looked at money for lower income and middle income people. I wanted to give everyone a heads up really quick. If you saw something that said we were going to be talking about investing today, we will not be doing that. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that I'm not a CFP, and just because I know how to invest best for my own family does not mean I know how to invest for your family. And the second reason is that for the vast majority of Americans, there's not a high enough income level to have that disposable income to invest. So when you do have that disposable income, you should be investing for your future. You should be retiring. But what we're going to focus on today is how to get you to that point faster. We're going to look at some things like marriage penalties when you're middle or lower income. We're going to talk about welfare use and our attitudes towards those and how we can kind of deconstruct them. And we're also going to talk about opening up future career opportunities through education. Like Angela said, I am the owner of Fem Frugality. That site turned 12 years old this year. You can find it at femfrugality.com. And I'm the author of the Feminist Financial Handbook. All right, so the first thing I want to talk to you guys about off the bat, before we get into anything else, is destigmatizing welfare use, right? I had a whole rant I was going to go on, and then something happens. My friend, my colleague here, Shalise Hurd, you can follow her on social media here. She has an upcoming book called The Neurodivergent Millionaire that I am really psyched to read. But she just happened to post this video that said everything I wanted to say a lot more eloquently and succinctly. And so I want to share that with you today with her permission. Let's have Shalise load here. Yeah.
I cannot hear her right now, Brynne.
Okay, one sec here. I did put the link in here in case that happened. Tell me if you can hear on Instagram. If not, I'll go through my little rant.
No.
No, good. Okay, well,
Well, we can drop the link here in the group chat so folks can watch it later.
100%, 100%. But the point is, is that being on any type of welfare or assistance program, it does not make you a bad or a lazy person. In fact, getting on these programs is often the thing that you need to do to get to that next step. And a lot of times what you'll see is that the people who rail against welfare the hardest are either people who qualify for it and don't want to get on it because of their own internalized shame. And we'll talk about that in a second here. Or they are people who are very wealthy and often use different programs like tax credits and grant funding or things like PPP to fund their own needs. And they have no shame or qualms in taking it. Sometimes they don't even think that they need it, but they'll take it just in case because that's the smart thing to do. But when you take that money, they label you as lazy or unintelligent or bad. And none of those things are true. And in fact, a lot of those things are rooted in systemic sexism and systemic racism. Um, Welfare in particular is a program where we see a lot of these things going wrong. So a part of my personal finance story is that I did use these welfare programs. I was extremely low income when I started writing about money. And I was also embarrassingly very stubborn about it. For years, I even had social workers come to me and say, babe, you got to get on these programs. You need to eat. You need to have access to these things. You qualify. These programs are built for people in your situation. There's no reason you should not be doing this. But I allowed my pride to get in the way. And I said, no, I'm going to do things on my own. I'm not going to get any help, right? But I, for way too long, did not engage. Then I got pregnant and I realized, you know what, it's okay if I want to do this thing where I'm picking between the electricity bill and food, if it's just affecting me. But when it starts affecting a child, I have no business doing that. I need to go get on this programming. I need to figure out how to get money to go back to school. I need to figure out how to get money to pay for food or formula or whatever. And so I engaged hardcore and I started writing about it.
I'd say though that even if it is just you deserve it just the same. It just because
Oh
it was your
yeah.
child did not mean that you deserve to struggle anymore
Oh,
when
a
it was
hundred
just you.
percent. And we're gonna get into that. So a couple years later, after I had, started using this programming and started working my way up slowly and progressively, but I did it. I was at the Heinz History Museum with my kids. They were super little, and they have this display there about the history of welfare and how it's so intricately tied to sexism, to racism, to upholding the patriarchy and the chirarchy and white supremacy, and how a lot of our attitudes and our policies today still uphold those values. I was real upset with myself after I found that out. I thought back on all the situations in my life where I had said all these things and all the ways that I had unintentionally harmed other people when I said those things. And the thing about a lot of these isms is that when we knowingly or not adopt them from our culture and internalize them, we often use them to hurt ourselves as well. And that's what I did for a very long time. I lived in really bad poverty for a while. I hurt myself because I had adopted these ideas. So I went home and I educated myself a little bit so I could learn better, so I could do better. I'm not going to take you through the entire history today, but I do want to touch on some of it because I feel like it's important to know and it can help us remove kind of that stigma that we project out onto others and onto ourselves. So welfare systems as we know it, I'm going to rewind us to like 1896, 1900. At that period, there was something called the Mother's Pension Program, and that was essentially a cash benefit program that paid widows to stay at home. The entire idea here was that women did not belong in the workplace. They belonged at home. And so we're going to pay you just enough money to get by to do that and stay home. You're not going to get wealthy. You're not going to get ahead, but at least you won't be in the workplace. With the mother's pension, it was not problematic at the time, according to our popular culture, but it was very problematic when we look back. You had to be a widow. The idea was you couldn't be a single unmarried mother. You couldn't be viewed as like a slut, right? And you couldn't be, you had to be white. And not only did you have to be white, you had to be the right kind of white. If you were Irish or Italian, depending on your state, you might not qualify. And you might not even have to be an immigrant. There's a lot of xenophobia within this program too. And obviously it's not available to Black women. It's only available to the right type of white women who are deserving, who are moral. And we have this very early idea of who is deserving of aid and assistance and basic dignity. Now, in 1935, we have the next iteration of this kind of program. It's called the ADC, which is a dependent child program. It was a benefit that was a part of the New Deal. And Southern senators and congressmen. I don't want to pretend like that's the only place racism existed within this, but they did put some pretty stringent restrictions on this program. It was more federally governed, but states still had certain rights to say who qualified for this and who did not. At the federal level, it was not open and available if you were a domestic worker or an agricultural worker. And at that time, that was the vast majority of the jobs that were open to Black citizens. And so at the federal level, it was mostly inaccessible to that population. And then at the state level, especially if you went down in the South, no matter where you worked, you weren't going to get access to it. There's still very much this idea of deserving embedded in it. Then if we go forward a little bit further into the 60s, when we have the civil rights movement, finally, we have a program that is administered almost completely at the federal level. So the standards are set there, which prevents states from setting their own discriminatory practices. We rename it the AFDC, but it's essentially the same thing, except for it removed the requirement that you could not be an agricultural domestic worker. So essentially what this does is it opens up this credit and some other social welfare programs to Black Americans effectively for one of the first times. And there was some serious white backlash with that. One thing that I want to encourage you guys to check out here is this Moynihan report. It's going to make you, I hope it makes you feel gross when you read it. It is really gross. It came out of the White House cabinet at the time. And essentially what it does at its core is because Black women are now able to access welfare programs, it goes in and blames Black single mothers for being Black single mothers. It essentially blames them for systemic racism and says that they have some work to do if they want to continue to be worthy of this. It's the inspiration for Reagan's welfare queen trope. It is a document that has a lot of ideas in it that you'll still hear in public discourse today. That does not make it good and it does not make it right. It's pretty awful. But I think understanding kind of where the documents and the ideas of where some of these things came from can help us recognize, oh, that's maybe not something I want to engage in. You fast forward to the 90s, we're getting rid of this ADC, AFDC thing, and we're starting to put work requirements now. Remember back here with the mother's pension, the whole goal was to have white deserving women not work, and the right kind of white deserving woman not work. But here, when Black women are eligible for these welfare programs, all of a sudden we start having work requirements with TANF. All of a sudden, the states, I mean, it's not all of a sudden, it's 30 years later, but we start seeing the states start getting more control over these programs again. And to this day with TANF, we see discrimination all over the country. It's really hard to actually access the cash benefit program. TANF doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but we see it especially in the South, and I don't think that's an accident. Another thing that we'll talk about in a minute here too is the EIC, which was also another replacement program for this AFDC stuff. So when we look back historically, we see that women have this right place and only the right kind of women and only the women who act the right way. We see that as Black people, particularly Black mothers, are permitted into these programs, we start seeing these concepts of deserving and viewing people who are on welfare as bad or lazy. We start seeing that be the primary theme. And so if you're sitting there feeling like, or judging others feeling like, oh, you need to do more, or oh, you need to meet my standards in order to deserve my dignity in order to apply for these programs, you don't need to do this on your own. And those ideas that we get are born out of a place that's extremely patriarchal and hierarchical. And so I'd encourage you to combat them. I find it really helpful to reframe personal finance when you're engaging with these programs. When we think of personal finance, we often think of like an income and an expense sheet, right? And that's it. That's all personal finance allows for, usually. I like to think of it more as resource allocation. And I find this is a really helpful framework to work with, because when we look at these rich people who are taking the tax credits, taking the grant funding, taking the PPP. That's what they're doing. They're allocating the different resources that are available to them. And you can do the same thing even if you're at a lower income level. If you're getting $500 a month in SNAP benefits, that's $500 on your spreadsheet that you can then allocate somewhere else. Towards building more financial stability for your family, whether you're building an emergency fund, whether you're saving up to go to school or send your kid to school. Like, you don't have to necessarily look at it as just income and expenses. You can look at it holistically as an entire resource bucket, and then you get to be smart in how you allocate it. If you are interested in combating some of these ideas that you see in yourself, and it's okay to recognize those things in yourself, it's in our culture. I'm like I said, I felt gross that I had engaged with them, but you can learn more by reading authors like Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks. Both brilliantly kind of cover the ideas that underlie this entire idea of deserving within our culture. There we go. Okay, so we're going to move on to the EITC. This is the Earned Income Tax Credit. We sometimes refer to it as the EIC. It functions as both a minimum wage subsidy and a subsidy on the high cost to care for children in the United States. It's actually very popular across parties. Like, all the presidents have supported it. Like, it's not usually a problem to pass it. Sometimes there's arguments about limits and everything. But it's not really a partisan thing. And part of that is because it subsidizes corporate America, so they don't have to pay you a living wage. And part of it is because it replaced, in part, this ADC as well. It tries to perform both these functions, and what ends up happening is you actually have a marriage penalty. Now, in traditional personal finance, you're going to hear a lot of times like, oh, get married, it's great for your taxes. When you are specifically lower income and sometimes even middle income, that's not true. In fact, getting married could cost you money. I'm going to show you guys really quick what this looked like for me. So these are like real numbers from the year that I got married. I did not know about this, or I might have pushed off marriage a year or two. Before we were married, if we had filed our taxes that year with me as head of household, claiming my kids like I usually did, and my now ex-husband as a single tax filer, my income that year was $22,000. It would have qualified me with the children for a $4,577 tax credit through the EIC. His income was $8,400, and his EIC would have been $472. That's a total EIC of $5,049. But we did get married, like that happened. So I had to file as a married household. So what they did was they considered both of our incomes. I wonder if I can't move the bar. All right. So it changes. So you combine your incomes on your tax return, right? And your combined income is what the EIC will look at. So our total income was $30,400, and our tax credit was somewhere around 3,000 something. It's right below this bar here. I'm sorry, guys. But it resulted in an effective marriage penalty that year for us of $1,519. And that doesn't sound like the biggest number in the world, but when you're pulling in like just over 30 grand, missing out on $1,500 was like a very big deal to our annual budget. Now, there are other programs with marriage penalties. They're a little bit trickier to illustrate than the EIC. SSI is the biggest one. We effectively have marriage inequality for the disability community in this country because of SSI marriage penalties. But there are other ones. There's SNAP, Medicaid, TANF, almost any program that's means tested, you're going to see these marriage penalties. Unlike the EIC, so the EIC totally depends on marriage. You can live together, but if you're not married and filing jointly, it doesn't matter. But these programs, actually, you're supposed to report even if you're cohabitating. So it's not so much a marriage penalty so much as a cohabitation penalty. To be real with you, to the best of my knowledge, these three programs, nobody really checks up on you anymore. It's been a couple decades since there was like super strict oversight of like who's living in your house. I still highly recommend you follow the rules and don't do anything illegal. Report everybody in your household. But with SSI in particular, they get really like men in black about it. Like they will check up on you. There's a lot of disabled people who are in a relationship and they might even live together, but they will not disclose to anyone that that person is who they're in a relationship with, because if they're living together and SSI finds out, they could lose their Medicaid, which for a lot of disabled people is a matter of life and death, that Medicaid access. And so they'll tell people, you know, oh, like this is like my landlord, or, you know, this is like my caretaker. Like, no, we're totally not dating. Because even just that act of cohabitating can inflict this marriage penalty and result in loss of benefits. Now, that is not to say that if you are low income, marriage is a bad idea. It's just to warn you that there are consequences that we don't often hear about in other personal finance spheres. However, there are some really, really, really big pros for marriage. One of the fun ones is lower car insurance premiums. Call up and let your insurance company know after you got married, because your bill will get knocked down. Potentially, you could get lower health insurance premiums. It depends on your employer insurance plan. I haven't found that to be true with the ACA. But another huge one is this one right here, these spousal security benefits, spousal social security benefits. So what that is let's say you've been with your partner for like most of your lives, but you never like officially got married. After your partner dies, you're not entitled to anything from Social Security. But there are, if you had been married that entire time, depending on who makes more money and who dies first, it's something like 50 to 75% of that partner's Social Security benefit will go to you. And that's something that you don't get if you're not married. And that's a long-term planning thing. So you don't necessarily want to plan just based on this year. I didn't get the EIC, so like I'm not going to get married. You also want to think about those longer term things. Religious views and how you feel about your relationship with your God is one thing too. I'm not particularly religious, but I don't want to discount that fact. It's maybe right for you, maybe not, but the point is, don't get married just for the tax benefits if you're low income, because if that's the reason you're doing it, you're not going to be happy with the results. All right, and the final thing I want to talk about here really quick is free college. So first question, is college still worth it? We hear about this a lot, especially with student loans and everything in the news right now. And the answer is yeah.
Our money bro bingo, that was definitely one of the bingo squares that
yes.
we played during our in-person event in Portland earlier this month. But there was definitely a thinks college isn't worth it, but also uses his degree is one of the bingo squares.
And you know what? It's funny. I was going to bring up tech bros because like, okay, I work in this financial space where like there's a lot of people who built their own thing. And I am fully open to the idea of someone building something from scratch, coming from nothing. I think those stories are super rare, and I'm super proud and impressed by the people I've seen who do it. Not saying it never happens, right? But a lot of times you hear this idea percolating among tech bros, and it's like, man, you were born in Connecticut, like with a very high income family, and you might have gotten away with not going to college because you already had the Yale network. You already had the Harvard network. You don't have to be qualified to get a job because you already know the right people. And if you were raised lower income or middle income, you don't have that same access to that network. And so go to college just for the network. And you don't have to be going Ivy League, like going to Penn State or going to Ohio State. Like those can be great schools to build a network with people who are going to be in similar job positions to you, or maybe even like hire you one day. That access to a network makes college important. And what we see is that a majority of high school only grads, they live in poverty. It's really exciting to hear about those rare stories where somebody breaks through, but it's not common. You're rolling the dice and you're probably going to lose. So it's really, really important to try to get that college education. And I recognize it's challenging. My own college journey was very disjointed. I went back non-traditionally. We're going to talk about some of the programs that I used really quickly, but like I don't want you to beat yourself up about it if you don't have a 4-year degree in adulthood, but I do want to let you know that like there's paths forward and that they are worth pursuing. Don't let people talk you out of it. Um, so the primary thing I want to talk about today is grant money. I actually would encourage you not to take out student loans if you don't have to. The max Pell Grant this year is $7,395. The average community college tuition is $4,973. Do you see that gap there? That gap is refundable. So if you qualify for a full max Pell Grant, you can get money refunded to you every semester to pay for your books, to pay for your living expenses, to pay. You have to be careful with the living expenses, but if you're at this income level, like you don't have to worry about it too much. If you're using it to pay for rent, you're good. Food, you're good. And over here, you'll see the number for some different scenarios. These are estimates. These are not set in stone yet, but these are like estimates-ish for next year about qualifying levels. You'll see that if you're a single mom, you got 2 kids, you can qualify for a max Pell Grant with an income of $51,818. And if you're a single mom with 3 kids, that jumps up into the $60,000 range. So this is not just for low income people. This is also for those middle income households. Even if you don't consider yourself to be living in poverty, you can still use some of these programs. The Pell Grant is kind of like, it'll go up or down depending on where you are on the income spectrum. So you can make up to these amounts, and you'll see that that same single mom with 3 kids can make up to 90 grand a year and still get some Pell Grant money. It might not be the max full Pell Grant, but you can still get some. And then if you look at, okay, so I went to community college, I got paid to do that. That was great. Now I want to transfer to a state school so they'll accept my community college credits. The average public college tuition is $10,622. You're a little short now with your Pell Grant, right? But if you qualify for a Pell Grant, there's a chance. The lower your income is, the higher the chance. If you're in this band, there's a very high chance that you qualify for another grant called the FSEOG grant. That's up to $4,000. Now, when we add $4,000 to this number right here, we start seeing that, oh, look, there's your book budget and your tuition for the year. So you can totally pay with these grants for the 2 years that you have at that public university or college. How much you get in that FSOG money varies. It does depend. And what we see with the Pell Grant is that technically it could run out, but we've never actually seen it run out. However, with these FSEOG grants, if you qualify for this, and don't assume that you don't, assume that you might, this money does run out. So this one is why it's so important to apply right when the FAFSA opens up. And this year, usually that's in October. This year it's in December. So if you're thinking about going back to school, mark your calendar for December. Another thing I wanted to talk about on tuition really quick was the Ivy League. Ivy League schools do accept non-traditional students. They do accept transfer students. And if you're making under 6 figures and you academically qualify to get into the school, there is a high odd that your entire tuition will be covered by institutional aid. Some schools even offer institutional aid for full tuition above the $100,000 mark, but it really depends on the school. Another thing that we hear about Ivy League institutions is that they don't help your income, so why waste your money? Well, first of all, that might be more free than your public college, depending on your income and your academic record. But the second thing is that that's a very white advice. For white people, it is true. Going to Ivy League doesn't necessarily up your income. But if you're a minority, going to an Ivy League and gaining, having that social network from that Ivy League, it's sad that improves your income, but like that is one thing, is that among minority populations, we do see the income level go up if they attend an Ivy League institution. And then if you do still have a gap, there's scholarships. One of the biggest things with the feedback on the book was that I had some people that are like, oh, I went to college in 2010 and I applied for scholarships and I didn't get any. So everything she said was wrong. And I was like, okay, well, I don't think you had this book back then. And I don't think you went through this whole system. This is something we talk about in the Feminist Financial Handbook a lot. There's an entire chapter dedicated to it. there's strategy involved in applying for scholarships. I've had like a 50 to 75% success rate applying for myself and helping my friends and family members apply as well. The first thing you want to do is draft a scholarship resume, and that's just where you outline everything that is unique about you, where you went to school, where you were born, what religion you are, what weird little hobbies you have, if you have webbed toes, like literally anything you can think of that makes you different or unique. You want to put that on the scholarship resume. And then you use those tenets to search for scholarships first at the local level. So like your city or borough or whatever. And then you can expand your search to the county level, and then to the state level, and then to the national level. And the reason you want to start local is because the competition is lower there. Some of these scholarships only have 1 or 2 people applying. So even if you write a terrible essay, you still might win. You want to write a good essay, but your odds are just so much higher when you're applying to these local and state level scholarships. I like big scholarship websites for some things, but when I'm applying for scholarships, if it's on a big scholarship website, that means everybody knows about it. And it means that a ton of people are applying for it. And it doesn't mean it's a bad scholarship. It just means that your odds of winning are lower because you've got more competition. So I like to spend more time doing a little bit more research and finding the ones that not everyone knows about. And the final thing is when you're writing your scholarship essay, don't tell a sob story. First of all, because that's not what the panel wants to hear. And second of all, because if you engage in kind of like this pity Olympics thing, someone's always going to have a sadder story than you. There's no way to win. Instead, what you want to do is you want to tell a strength story. So let's say that the prompt for the scholarship says, we're looking for someone who demonstrates perseverance. Well, think on that topic, perseverance, and go back on your life and think of a time that you persevered. The story doesn't have to be tragic. It can be incredibly mundane. I've used really simple stories from like, I don't know, I had to work with somebody who was hard to work with at work and like how I handled that situation and dealt with that situation. And that happened to demonstrate the qualities they were looking for in that essay. And then when you get to the end of the essay, just kind of tie it all together. Like I am going back to school now. I could give up on my dream of completing my degree. I could say I don't have enough money and it's impossible. But instead, I'm going out and I'm applying for all of these scholarships, and I'm going to make my dreams come through my perseverance. And so really just tying all of that through. All right. And finally, we've got some resources. If you guys want to screenshot this page, you can see all the links that you need and everything. But these
Can
are
we
just
share these slides on Woven?
100%. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So if you can email them to me then, or if you want to just put them up there yourself, we can put all of these up on Woven so people don't have to remember to take screenshots or notes.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds great. That's all I've got.
So thank you so much for sharing this. I had no idea that the Pell Grant numbers were so high. It's
Yeah.
so wild.
And a lot of times when you are applying, let's say that like you were 18, right? You're considered a dependent student. And so you're going to be judged on a stricter level than somebody who is fully grown and independent. The age is 24 technically, but if you get married, don't get married or have kids in order to get a Pell Grant. But if you're under 24 and you get married or have kids, you also become an independent student. And so I think a lot
So
of people have a
I
negative
would have
experience.
qualified at, getting married at 21. I mean, I'd already done college, but
Yeah, you would have.
I'd never thought about it that because my, graduating in 2009, my post undergrad income was not good. Yeah. But I just wanted to also bring up for folks that weren't following along in the chat, where Brynne is talking about the marriage penalty. And Stephanie brought it up as well in the book, The Whiteness of Wealth by Dorothy Brown. She talks about this a lot. And Stephanie brought up also that there is a student loan like interest penalty also. So when you file your taxes, it's the same limit for student loans if you're married or single. So it's just like one more thing. But for folks who have not read that book, she really gets into like the deep like racism that also comes with our tax code that impacts a lot of the stuff that Brynne was talking about as well. And then can you also share some of those links for the different like history of the programs? We can put that in Woven too, so people can read up who have an interest in that. So I also do want to give away a copy of your book. So for the folks that are hanging out with us still, I am just going to take the like list of folks and I'm going to put it in a random number generator and then pick the winner from there. I'm saying in the comment. Schools also have a process that you can apply for to determine if you're independent before 24 due to extenuating life circumstances. Do you know what like sort of things that qualify for that? I know that I definitely went to college with friends that were, you know, independent from their parents, but still couldn't get anything from the FAFSA.
Right. That was the situation I was in. I was in some kind of like, I was in a situation that a normal person would think like, oh, she should qualify as independent. But I still couldn't get it. I like how you said that it's not as broad as you would hope, because that's really true. A lot of times, even like, oh, I don't talk to my parents or they don't give me any financial support, they don't really care. I mean, if you get the right counselor within that financial aid office and they're really into helping you, you might be able to find a way to make it work. And you should definitely pursue every avenue that you have. Try it. Don't not try, but also just be prepared that that exception is extremely difficult to get.
So I did spin the random number wheel and Barb is the winner. So I don't know if you see that on your phone, but send us an email and we will be happy to get you a copy of Brynne's book. Does anyone have any final questions while we're all hanging out here, or thoughts or anything you feel like sharing? Brynne is also in Woven, so if you have any follow-up questions for her, you can also find her there. With that, I am going to say thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for, you know, not pulling punches about the history of a lot of these aid programs, because I think it really does. I think it would help change the conversation and folks' opinions on using programs available to them if they really realize like how bad the history is and why, you know, signing up for the programs you qualify for is, you know, fighting misogyny and the patriarchy and racism and, you know, sticking it to the man. So I would encourage that everyone who qualifies to apply. And if you don't qualify, maybe this conversation has helped you get a little bit different perspective when you're hearing or talking about other folks using the programs that are available to them. So thank you so very much, Brynne. It is always wonderful to talk to you.
Oh, you too. Thank you.